Hello, and welcome back to Policy Voices, the podcast from Friends of Europe. I'm your host, Sabina Șancu, and this week we're bringing you another episode from our Women, Peace and Security series. As the UN Resolution on Women, Peace and Security, also known as WPS, reaches its 25th anniversary, the credibility of its global implementation is facing scrutiny, increasingly so. Despite formal commitments from over 100 countries and major institutions, the agenda continues to struggle with turning rhetoric into reality. In this crucial moment, Friends of Europe has launched the Frontline Voices, Women Shaping Peace and Security project in partnership with Canada's Department of National Defence via the Mobilizing Insights in Defence and Security program, also known as MINDS. Through a series of working groups, a final report, and a public debate, the participants assessed and reimagined the WPS agenda. And on this episode, my colleague, Eugenia Rossi, and I got to talk to one of the people who was there at the foundation of the WPS agenda. We spoke to Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, who is now the founder and CEO of International Civil Society Action Network, or ICAN, where she brings together independent women-led organizations from multiple countries towards preventing violence and promoting peace. But 25 years ago, Sanam was a civil society leader, and she was one of the people who helped draft the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that enshrined the WPS agenda into our international rule-based order. So I cannot wait for you to enjoy this in-depth conversation with one of the people who has truly shaped our world. You are the founder of the International Civil Society Action Network. And there at ICAN, you lead the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership. Could you start by telling us a little bit about that work and how it connects to the wider struggles and hopes of the WPS agenda?
If I go back, I was involved in the mobilization for what became Resolution 1325 and recognizing women's peacebuilding work. That's really been my kind of MO. That's really been my interest and inspiration has been. And we got the resolution in 2000. We thought that the Security Council and governments would, take responsibility now that they had a mandate. But it was very clear that it really wasn't going to happen. And this goes back to, 9/11 happened and war on terrorism and then the bureaucratization of these kinds of things. So the original story of where 1325 came from, which was women peacebuilders in war zones or women who were doing peacebuilding work in war zones, that got lost and it became this heavy, technocratic, bureaucratized agenda. But on the ground, these women were continued to do their work, right? And so when I founded ICAN in 2005, 2006, it was in response to women peacebuilders or women that I knew who were saying, we need a global home where we can come together that is really ours. And our mantra is locally rooted, globally connected. So the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, which we formalized as an alliance in 2015, was in response to the call from the ground, and it was co-created with our partners. So it wasn't just me waking up one morning and saying, we're going to have a network. Actually, what we did was for a number of years, we would convene as a forum, women from different organizations, from different countries. And I remember saying to people that I don't want to call it a network because it feels like forced marriage. You can't just say I show up at a meeting and, now we have a network. You have to weave the net and do the work together, or you do the work and then the net gets woven. But it was a very conscious decision to say, we need a new alliance. How does this connect with other international alliances of women's organizations and movements? We had a discussion. We brought people from different sectors together, and it became very clear that there is a gap in the sector around recognition of women-led organizations that are really at the cutting edge of peace and security work. Many of our partners do a lot of work on de-radicalization and prevention of violent extremism. That they're all in conflict areas. So it was about peace and security work. Attached to it, of course, there's livelihoods and rights and so forth. But it's the uniqueness of recognizing peace building work in how these women themselves define it in their own country. So that's how we started. Fast forward, we now have over 85 organizations that are members in 42 countries. Some are networks within their own country, so they really have wide reach. Some we have helped expand their reach across their networks. And some of them are activists who were doing such great work that we were able to then support them to establish their own organizations and be systemically present in their own societies.
I'm interested in this because Eugenia was telling me about this idea that was being discussed in some of the working groups about women, peace, and security, having definitions that come from a certain view of the world, which might be more Western-centric, even though, of course, in the last 30 years or so, we've rarely seen any conflict in Western countries. So how do you respond to the characterization of WPS as a Western construct? And what gets lost in looking at it that way?
Well, I kind of laugh and roll my eyes when I hear that it's a Western construct, to be honest, because I was there at the beginning, right? So, if you trace back the history, in 1995, at the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women, it was women from South Africa and Israel, Palestine and Guatemala and Bosnia and Rwanda and places like that who came to the Beijing conference and added the agenda of women and armed conflict. It was post-genocide in Rwanda. It was post-genocide in Bosnia. Israel-Palestine had just, the peace agreement had been signed. Women had played a really critical role, similarly with Northern Ireland. So it came from people who had the lived experience of conflict. That was kind of the first plant that was seeded. Then you sort of fast forward, and I was working in London at an organization called International Alert. I joined them in 1996. But the first program on women in conflict was actually started by a Senegalese colleague of mine called Ndeye Sow. And it was working with Burundian women, because having seen what happened in Rwanda, there was an attempt at sort of mitigating a similar genocide in Burundi in the mid-90s, when there were 50,000 people getting killed a year. And she went in as part of the International Alert programming to say, well, let's work with women and see what's happening. And she found that if you work with social workers, health workers, teachers, and they engage them, they have access to society in a very different way to say, political men do. So we see this practice. And then at Alert, I'm Iranian by background. My colleague who was Costa Rican, my other colleague who was Guyanan. It was a bunch of women who come again from experiences of crisis and conflict, coming together and saying, all this talk about conflict prevention and all the structural, institutional approaches that were being developed at the time, early warning indicators of conflict, and if we have warnings, then the international community will step in and so forth, was happening. But the reality on the ground was very different. The reality on the ground was that people knew when tension was rising, and there was no response from the international community side. And actually, it was women who were stepping in and doing the work. So we then in 1998 had the first global conference of women from war zones around the world here in London. We had women who had been fighters for liberation. So they'd been part of the MK, which is the armed group of the South African ANC. We had women who had been survivors of war, people who'd been there was an Israeli woman who was part of the Four Mothers movement at the time. They had mobilized to get Israeli occupation of Lebanon ended. And Rwandans, and it was an amazing gathering. And it just came to us. I mean, I was sitting in this room, I was in my late 20s, and I looked at it and I was like, if I'm interested in the idea of conflict transformation and conflict prevention, the women are doing it. And so we need a global sort of vocabulary or some framing of the women's experiences. And from that conference at that conference, that was the key message, that it was like, we need to have something global that holds us together. And we started a campaign called Women Building Peace, from the village council to the negotiating table. And one of my colleagues later told me that I had said in the bathroom at one point, well, if Al Gore can go to the Security Council, we can too. And so the security, it was like, why, Security Council, EU, OSCE. We had the Security Council in our target, obviously on the sort of on the horizon. We wanted, that was one of the goals. But as a young woman, I didn't see why it should be so hard to breach the walls of the Security Council. I was like, well, let's go. Well, what's the problem here? And of course, it wasn't as easy as it seems. But the point being that the agenda started with women from war zones. And the campaign was one of the ways that we did it was to partner with organizations in war zones around the world and ask them to consult with women and say, what would you want? What do you want the world to do when they're engaging or when they're trying to prevent and mitigate conflict? So the issues came from women at the front lines of real wars. And at the time in the West, apart from Bosnia and Northern Ireland, the rest of Europe was not at all engaged. And I mean, there was none of this problems of right-wing extremism or anti-immigrant. So it really wasn't a Western concern at all. It wasn't even a Western concern for women's movements in the West. They had other issues. Over time, once we got the Security Council agenda, then all of a sudden it kind of became co-opted in different ways by institutions, by other aspects of civil society, and this idea that it was Western driven, but it really wasn't. And I should add also that at the Security Council, the countries that were our first allies were Bangladesh, Namibia, Jamaica, Canada at the time, and the others came on later once they saw how the momentum was building up. And Namibia often gets forgotten, but if it hadn't been for them, we wouldn't have had a resolution, because they were interested in the problem of sexual exploitation by peacekeepers, and they'd had a conference in May of 2000 in Windhoek on how to increase the number of women peacekeepers and how to train UN peacekeepers to not rape and abuse local populations, which had been a big problem and continues to be a bit of a problem still. And peacekeeping sits in on the agenda of the Security Council. Peacekeeping is one of their agenda items. So we went to speak to them to say, well, we want it to be about prevention of conflict, participation of women, protection, legal and physical protection in crisis settings and post-conflict. Can we add that to your peacekeeping agenda? And they said yes. And that's how we got the sort of the 4 pillars of the agenda. But if we hadn't had Namibia being willing to expand their horizon and engage with us, we may not have been able to get the resolution.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go back for a second to the co-optation of the agenda. And I understand this is maybe a rather more recent phenomenon. And I was wondering, what's your take on the militarization on the agenda, like the shifting focus on that side rather than peace building?
So I think that it happened actually quite well. There are 2 factors that happen. So one is, and I have to caveat this, I'm sure I'm going to be very unpopular if I say this, but we need to say it because it's 25 years and we have to say things. But the first thing is that those of us who came with this agenda were at the time a younger generation, as I say, of not necessarily maybe Western based, but not necessarily Western in an attitude and approach to these issues, and we were bringing this global perspective. And what we found was that the traditional Western women's rights movements didn't really know what to do with this agenda, and then the nascent peace building or peace organizations also didn't really know what to do with it, because it was they were like, oh, it's just about it's women's stuff, it's that's women's issues, and we were saying no, it's women speaking about peace. And to the women's rights movement, we were saying we have a right to be in the spaces of decision making on peace and security. It's not just about livelihoods and reproductive rights. All those things matter, but genuinely for me as a young woman at the time, I was like, well, why shouldn't I be sitting and thinking about the future of my country as an Iranian, right? So it was a bit of a shift in those ways. And I remembered that there were sort of these inflection points where at some point, for example, within the UN system, they started talking about 1325, it's peace for women. We want women to be at the peace table, to have peace for women. And I was like, that's like a stabbing this agenda in the back, because the women on the ground who speak about these issues are talking about peace for everyone. They're talking about their sons being taken or their fathers or their husbands, or it's not just, I want peace for me. And it would be really, it is very damaging to frame it in that way, because when you have wars, often it's men who are getting killed. So, even the narrative that came out of UN Women or UNIFEM at the time of our women are disproportionately affected by war is not true. The Iraq War that started in 2003, 90% of people being killed were men, right? So it's not disproportionate, it's differential. If men are being killed, women are being left to fend for themselves and having to pick up life in a different way. Women get, are much more targeted for sexual violence than men are, but men are too, right? So it was looking at the complexity in that way. So the first challenge for me has always been that this idea of this agenda is for women, it's women's rights only, as opposed to actually being respectful of what women were saying about the fact that we want to have a say, but for our own, for society as a whole. And every issue is a women's issue, basically. Then the militarization started to happen when in the US, the agenda became, the political ecosystem in Washington became aware of it. And I was there at the time. And it was towards the end of the Bush administration, right at the end of the Bush administration, they wanted to do something. The wives of the ambassadors had seen a film about sexual violence. And so all of a sudden, the Americans became champions of addressing conflict-related sexual violence in 2008. With the Obama administration coming in, we as civil society thought, well, it's time for the Americans to, embrace and come into this space. And so we were doing a lot of advocacy with Hillary Clinton's State Department at the time and the National Security Advisor, Samantha Power, and brought together, the first conference in DC on national action plans and what that means and so forth. And I remember telling my friends then that, oh my God, somehow between New York and Washington, women, peace, and security comes on the train, and in Philadelphia, the word peace gets thrown out, and it arrives in Washington, and it's women and security. And so there were these conferences we'd go, whatever gatherings we'd go to, and they'd have the military. And I just remember kind of putting my hand on my head and thinking, my God, what have we started here? Because it was like, yes, we have women pilots who are involved in the conflict on Libya, or, for Afghanistan. They kept talking about, well, we have female engagement teams. And we kept asking, but if you're sending American female officers in American uniform, military uniform to Afghanistan to talk to women, to get information from them about Taliban movements or whatever's going on in the community, what protection mechanisms do you have for them? Because now you're framing women as informers, right? And they would just look at us blankly and not have an answer. So this framing of it becoming women and security was something that I saw happen in the US context. And then it kind of merged together with the sort of women's rights agenda aspect of it, because it literally became about, well, we want more women in the military, equal opportunity for engagement in the military. Personally, I don't have a problem with that. If people want to go join the army, of course there should be equal opportunity. But this agenda was not about saying that, my daughters should have equal right to go and kill and maim and be killed and maimed in wars. The agenda was about transformative equality, to say, we don't want wars, because we don't want our sons and our brothers and our husbands and the men in our societies to have to experience the threat of going to either to kill or be killed. So the transformative equality aspect of it got lost. The peace aspect of it also got lost. And that's been the struggle that we continue to have in this space, I think, however many, 25 years on.
I think that having effective peace building is the best that you can do for your security. And sometimes this gets lost in our present defense focus. I wanted to ask a little follow-up. Besides acknowledging what is happening, especially with the militarized focus and giving space to peace in our conversations and national action plans, is there anything else that we can do about this? Like, how can we get the message through? Because now, especially from the European point of view, but I'm sure not only, there is this huge security and defense focus, and it's very hard to shift the narrative.
So first of all, I think we have to acknowledge the complexity and the nuances, right? So I, as an advocate for this agenda, I challenge the militarization of our societies. I challenge, and I'm concerned about militarizing humanity. The fact that we have these heavy military presence in terms of police on our streets and protests are being attacked in this way and so forth, right? Or the budgets that are shifting. That is a concern. That does not mean that I am anti-military. It doesn't mean that I'm anti-police. What it means is that I want to engage the military and the police and our security sector in a really grounded way, to say, what are the threats that we're facing as a society? And look at that complexity and say, well, are we adjusting our security sector to meet that reality, right? So for example, in many countries, including in the West now, the problem of organized crime is a big issue. You can't deal with organized crime in your communities and in your neighborhoods just by having heavily armed police or having, 55 new tanks, right? That's not the problem. It's a different way of thinking about, okay, why does organized crime get to come in? How do they end up recruiting? Why do young people, men, women, end up joining these entities? Are they being coerced? Are they being promised something? What are the other opportunities? What are the constraints and so forth? But it's a real issue. It's a real threat. I talk to my partners in Trinidad, they're talking about Venezuelan gangs. We talk to our partners in South Africa, they're talking about criminal gangs and organized crime over there. So that's as a security threat. Our police and our armies and our intelligence forces probably understand that. The question is whether the politicians understand that. When COVID happened, it was a threat to our societies, this unknown virus that was, affecting everybody. I was in the States at the time, and they didn't have enough masks and protective cover for the nurses and doctors, but they were testing potentially nuclear-headed drones at $168 million a pop. And you sort of think, well, that's my tax money. If I am concerned about security, but I don't think that nuclear-headed drone is giving me security. So then you have to say, okay, if the security so number one, I think engaging with the security sector is actually really important. A lot of our partners in our network at ICAN and WASP do that. And last year we published a report called The Odd Couple, and it's about how peace builders work with, engage their army and police and so forth. And the cooperation, not collaboration in an informant way, but how you do community security work and how you build the trust to be able to address things like threats of terrorism and threats of crime. And we published this report. And when I've spoken about it with others in the security sector, the first people to say to me, oh, we as the army or we as the security sector are just one tool in the toolbox of state and human security, are the army themselves. So then that's where you say, okay, well, if the army is saying the same thing that we're saying, that you need a more holistic, nuanced approach, where is this push coming from? And if you bring it to Brussels, where you guys are, and you look at how weapons industry, the weapons companies, have increased their lobbying of our political forces, whether parliamentarians in the UK or the US or EU commissioners and others, you realize that they've had a 40% increase in their lobbying efforts. If their voice is loud and persistent and present, then the sale of arms or weapons as the solution has been normalized or is becoming more and more normalized. Our sector needs to engage in that discussion. We need to be able to have a nuanced, complex understanding of, yes, for Ukraine, and they need the military equipment, but we also need the diplomatic solutions, or we need to sort of have pressure, think about it in a holistic way in terms of how we engage Russia in a way to get the war to stop, but also to have some level of containment and protect ourselves. This is important. The Poles are understandably worried about what's going on. So I'm not against that aspect of defense. On the other hand, it's also really important to understand that by being oppressive and violent, we're not going to stop refugee flows and migrant flows on the southern border of Europe by treating people badly or by enabling wars in those places. These things are connected. If Israel is bombing Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and Qatar and basically having a genocidal violence in Palestine, you can't support that, or you can't one way or another, politically or militarily, aid and abet that, and then say that, oh, everything's going to be fine in Europe. It's not. Being able to look at it holistically and saying what are the parameters of what we need, and then relate the second part of that is making sure that our military and our police and our intelligence sources are behaving ethically and morally and to the standards of practice that they should be, not enabling them to be oppressive, because what we know from other countries is that one of the key indicators of vigilantism or gang violence or radicalization into, identity-based movements, violent identity-based movements, is when you've had the state being unjust and oppressive and violent towards you. If they've been a predatory state or predatory police or corrupt police, that's how people then react to it. So instead of waiting for that to happen, let's make sure that our own forces are actually being just and fair to the populations that exist. And we know what good policing looks like. We've all seen it. We've had protests where the police are there and you feel that they're protecting you and they are enabling dissent and democracy being practiced on the street. And we've seen places where police are being overly violent and instrumentalized by the political forces. That I think is the saddest part, that politicians are instrumentalizing the security forces against their own populations, as opposed to adhering to the fact that the security forces, their mandate is service to the country and service to the people. It's not to be the instrument of one political party or another.
Of course. And I think I like this direction that you're taking to like bring us out a bit out of this not slippery slope of militarization, authoritarianism, and social divisions, to hang on to, let's say, a ray of hope. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about a positive example of implementation of the WPS agenda before it all got militarized, before it got damaged. And if you think that now might be a good moment to try to redeem and rebuild and re-implement with new energies this agenda, and if so, how?
I'm lucky because of the network and my partners that I work with, that every day I see good practices. So as much as it's being, the discourse and whatever the conversations are in Europe or in America or elsewhere are being distorted, on the ground, I've been privileged enough to work with people who are making it real. And I've had the privilege of being in a situation where I can help them make it real. So that, I think, is what allows me to get up in the morning and carry on doing what I do. Examples that I can give you. In Nigeria right now, we have a colleague, and we've been supporting her since 2015. She works really at the forefront of the Boko Haram challenges. And when we first started working with her, she said, look, Boko Haram is advocating that education is anti-Islamic. It's haram. Children shouldn't go to school. But the first thing that the Prophet Muhammad teaches you is that every Muslim has the responsibility of being educated. So what we helped her with was a radio program where she brought Islamic leaders from their own communities, speaking in local language, for 3 months on the radio, doing calls, so people could call in and ask questions and so forth. And they had a 40% increase in school enrollment in that 3-month period. She also did peace clubs in school. So she would take concepts of peace building and coexistence and match it with Islamic teachings, from the Quran, to say this is, Islam teaches this. So it was countering Boko Haram first in that way, as on a preventive measure. Then she was working with the communities and seeing that there are places where the army has been violent. And so families have joined Boko Haram to counter the violence of the army. And then other places where Boko Haram has kidnapped folks and so forth. Fast forward over the last 10 years, she's now not only working with especially women and girls who were abducted and then brainwashed into joining Boko Haram and de-radicalizing them and helping them be reintegrated into society and into their families. She's doing that work. She has networks of thousands of women who are affiliated and either looking for their missing relatives, but helping them advocate. And at the same time, she's also working with the army. And she is basically training the army. She's been asked to go and get involved and train the army in their behavior towards their communities and seeing the change in practice of the military towards their own society. This is WPS in real time on a daily basis, happening every day. Every time I speak with her, she's got a different story to tell me. In Sri Lanka, we have a colleague. Again, she started this work in 1998 because her son went missing. He'd been an army officer. And she asked the military for what happened, like what happened to my son and 600 others. And they wouldn't answer. So she mobilized the mothers and the parents of the servicemen. She then led a delegation of mothers into the jungle. They were the first ones to meet and talk to the Tamil Tigers, the Liberation Tigers, who were renowned, terrorists and the first ones to use suicide bombings and so forth. But they sat as women to speak with them. Those discussions opened up a channel of communication for ceasefire negotiations and subsequent, eventually peace talks. But then again, another war broke out. But she's continued to work with those communities. And in the last couple of years, she has been leading an effort to bring Tamil diaspora, who are some of the most hardened kind of, and because they've had such a history of oppression, together with Sinhalese Buddhist monks who are also quite extreme in their views, and creating a space for them to dialogue. And one of the more recent pieces of work that she's done is that they've identified that a lot of tension arises in context or in locations where you have contestation about religious relics and artifacts and buildings. And, somebody says, this is, we were here first, we had a temple, and the other one says, no, we were here first. And so archaeology. So she's actually initiated an archaeological project, bringing together the religious leaders from the different communities, archaeologists to look and see what's happening, the local communities to say, okay, if we clean up and make these places sites for tourism and ecotourism, what would that be? So this is peace building, and it's being led by a woman. And her name is Visakha Dharmadasa. So they are on the ground. In Syria, I can tell you what they're doing right now. A colleague of ours coined the phrase social reconciliation, because she says it's not enough to make just political peace or, this new government that's come in. They may have the best intention, but when you've had conflict really embedded in society, and when you've had retribution and revenge and anger between communities, you need to weave the peace from below. And so that's the kind of work that they're doing on the ground right now. This is all women, peace, and security. It's women taking the lead, reimagining what society should be like, coming up with new solutions for peace and security for their society. So yeah, I can give you endless stories of this reality. And our struggle has been that we want to make sure that this experience is understood internationally. And by internationally, not only across these countries, for our Colombian partners to learn from our Cameroonian, or a Cameroonian to learn from the Mexican and the Brazilian, we're doing that amongst themselves, but at a governmental level, and especially in the Western context, because the West persists in thinking that they have the answers, persists in thinking that they are there to bestow empowerment on women. And, we're all saying, no, it's not, you don't empower. It's not about you empowered. These are self-empowered. We are empowered through our own cultural context, but you sit with the privilege of access. And so open the doors, share your privilege, share your spaces, let these women come in, convene and hear their solutions and heed their advice about what you should be doing or not doing, because so often the international intervention ends up being more damaging than supportive.
I was going to ask about the most striking moment of hope for you, for WPS being implemented, improved, or understood better, or maybe if the moment of hope was 25 years ago and it has been going down since then. Also, what was the greatest source of frustration, and possibly how can we address that?
If I think about it historically and then where we are now, the hope and the belief we had 25 years ago was that our institutions, our multilateral institutions, matter. They are important. The idea of we, the peoples of the United Nations, engaging and being part of the story of preventing the scourge of war for future generations, like that. The Charter of the UN was such a visionary charter. And coming at it saying, look, post-Cold War, the nature of warfare has changed. It's civil wars, these kind of complexity of actors and so forth. It's not just interstate. Civilians are becoming increasingly the targets. And the UN system was designed to stop interstate wars. And so our hope was that by engaging the Security Council, and very importantly, the Security Council, we were saying, let's evolve the system, the institution, to manage and address these new challenges. And we, the peoples, we as civil society are here to work with you. So 1325 was a mandate to UN envoys and to others to say, when you go in, you don't just need to talk to the politicians and the armed groups, you can actually talk to the non-armed civil society actors as well. And at the time, our hope was that we believed in these institutions doing the right thing. That hope, I think, has been so devastated after 9/11, with the Americans going into Iraq despite a Security Council resolution that vetoed it. The various decisions that were made in terms of using the military vis-a-vis Libya, and then sitting on their, not dealing with Syria in an effective way, and then Yemen, starting off with good intentions and an envoy who designed this incredibly inclusive national dialogue process, but then overnight having the whole thing thrown out and Security Council green lighting Saudi bombing of Yemen, and then Afghanistan and the way in which major powers handed over power to the Taliban and didn't listen to Afghan women. So it's hard to believe and have hope in that particular institution. But that said, to me, the hope and the energy, again, comes from the ground up, because, it's almost like we're reverting back to history, that before the nation state, before this supranational systems, how did people resolve conflict? How did they mitigate it? How did they look after their own societies? They did it through mediation and engagement, and they had their own local structures. And women were deeply embedded in those structures. They had every culture I look at, women have always had agency and power and influence in a different way. They made, it wasn't that they were the chief of the tribe necessarily, even though sometimes they may have been, but they had a spiritual, moral, ethical influence and power that they used. And actually with the nation state and the structuring of systems, women have been erased. And the power of women and the influence that women have has been erased. And colonialism expedited that in many places, because we ended up with Victorian values in Africa and Asia, in places where women had power and women had rights. And so, anyway, so it's a long story of social archaeology that we have to think about. But I feel that right now, at this moment where we're seeing the multilateral system completely sclerotic and unable to cope, and transactional, I don't even want to call it diplomacy, it's just transactional use of violence, to move things. And the energy and the potential and the hope for me sits at the local level, sits in societies. And in a way, it's the dialogue that we need to have with national leaders and community and subnational leaders to say, don't trust that international actors have your interests at heart at all. They don't. They never did, really. But those institutions no longer function. And so what you're doing yourself to preserve and protect your societies and the responsibility that you've taken, that's where we need to put our energy. One thing that I say is that the powerful have abrogated their responsibility and the least powerful have taken on that responsibility. And so let's try and contain the damage that powerful states can make. But actually, part of the way we do that is by recognizing this incredible energy that sits on the ground for people who just want dignity, human security, better future for their children, and purpose in their lives. And so let's give them those opportunities. Let's provide that opportunity for young people so that they don't have to go join a gang or a militia or, the army.
I think I completely agree with this. I would define very realist vision of international relations. At the same time, international organizations do exist and they want to present themselves with a narrative that is different from the reality. So I think there is still space. I don't know if you agree, but I think there is still space to force them to be at least a little bit closer with the narrative that they give of themselves, that they do defend WPS, that they do listen to local population and etc., that they are on the side of peace. So I don't know, is there hope with that? What do you think?
This, to me, is the irony that we as civil society are probably the greatest champions and advocates of our international institutions, right? Like I've worked at the UN. When I'm at the UN, sometimes, I'm in the elevator and I look around and there are people from 6 different countries, 7 different countries. And I'm like, wow, this is like being at the UN. I mean, there's something so magical about being in multilateral spaces with people from other contexts, seeing the deep similarity of the human experience. I mean, there's a reason why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are universal. It's embedded in the human experience. There's nothing Western or Eastern about any of these things. It's the human experience that wants justice, that wants dignity, and so. These institutions really are important. Similarly with the European Union, I was there, I think it was in 2008, when the EU was awarded the Nobel Prize. And, I was working with people in the External Action Service and they were saying, feeling very cynical. And I said, but it's amazing. We forget that 100 years ago, these countries were killing each other and they instigated world wars for everybody else. And look at where we are now. Look at how people feel European, German and Spanish and Italian, and we're all, our children are everywhere. And the cultural weaving together of Europe is an extraordinary project. I definitely value, and I think these institutions are absolutely critical. The question is whether the institutions, and when I say the institutions, I mean the leaders, the bureaucrats, the technocrats that are working in these institutions, are able to lift their heads and understand the vision of why the entity exists, that bigger picture vision, and that they are custodians of this generation for the next generation. So a previous generation created the institutions with a vision and an ideal, and we can look and say, well, to what extent did they reach the ideal or not? It's a work in progress and new issues have come up. But each generation is responsible to enabling it to be effective and good for practice for the next one. It's a little bit like saying somebody, your great-grandparents, built this beautiful house, beautiful garden, and the next generation gets it, and they sit there and they don't really spend that much time painting or figuring. And the next generation, and by the time it comes to the current generation, the paint is peeling off, the water pipes are dodgy, the garden is now full of chemicals, and they just think, well, it's, I've had the best, I had it good when I got it, and this is the way it is, and so I'm just going to preserve my little piece of this, but actually not think that your responsibility is to make it work for the next generation and engage with them to understand the amazing human endeavor that led us to where we are. And that's the part that I find tragic because we seem to be caught in little minds as opposed to big minds. The imagination is gone, the inspiration is gone. And not everybody. I mean, you always have great people working inside these systems, but it's almost as if the bureaucracy eats the best. The bureaucracy wants to sort of tamp down the imaginative, the innovative, the creative, the energetic. And I'm like, no, the bureaucracy should be there to enable that innovation and that spirit and the energy that was at the founding of these institutions. The acronym for ICAN is ICAN, and I go back to that very often because I'm like, well, what can I do? Right? It's very easy to sit and say, well, we can't do that, and oh no, that can't be done, and from the little things to the big things. Whereas if you frame it around and you say, well, what can I do? Let's imagine. Why have we stopped the ability to imagine an alternative and to step into that space? The bad guys, if we want to think about it, whether it's, organized crime, whether it's big tech, big oil, big whatever, those folks have a vision of the societies they want to create. And it's the challenge of our time for our political leaders and civil society to say, what's our vision? Because if you leave a vacuum, negative forces fill it.
Thank you so much, Sanam, for this absolutely illuminating conversation. It's truly been a pleasure and an honor, and such a major point of our Frontline Voices project to get to talk to someone who wrote the WPS agenda into a UN resolution. Now, you will hear from me on another episode next Friday. Thank you so much for listening. Please interact with this post in the comments wherever you saw it, whether it be LinkedIn or Instagram usually. Until next time.